Hi, everybody. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Winespeed. And this is our four-part series called Defining the Dust. 4 evenings of great wines from the Rutherford appellation in the Napa Valley. Thank you for being here. If you've joined us before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we are so glad to have you. We've got some exciting wines and a terrific conversation. So Rutherford, when I first started coming to Napa Valley in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were 2 appellations that were, in a sense, the most important. And they were right there right in smack dab in the center of the Napa Valley, right in the heart of Napa Valley, Rutherford, and in a sense, its sister appellation, Oakville. It's where a lot of the action in the Napa Valley was and where a lot of the action in Napa Valley remains. So I'm excited about tonight and about our 4 evenings to come. Let me tell you who's here with us. Molly Hill is the winemaker of Sequoia Grove. And there you see Molly. Welcome, Molly. And Elizabeth DeLouise-Gant is the winemaker of Conn Creek. So Molly and Elizabeth, before we taste, I want to just quickly put up a map of Napa Valley so everyone can just remember where Rutherford is, right in the heart. So let's throw up this map for a second. And there you see the Napa Valley Vintner Association AVA map, and Rutherford pretty much right in the center there. The entire appellation spans from the east, from the Vaca Mountain Range, to the west, to the Mayacamas Mountain Range. So it's really quite a fascinating AVA that became an AVA in 1993, by the way. Okay, so with that, Molly, let's start with you. Sequoia Grove is owned by the Kopp family, which owns the absolutely terrific importer co-brand as well as Sequoia Grove. But give us a brief, tell us the story of the founding of Sequoia Grove.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Sequoia Grove was founded in 1978 in Rutherford in the heart of Napa Valley. We were founded by Jim and Steve Allen. Steve Allen founded Sequoia Grove with a dream to produce the best Bordeaux style wines in the world. Thank goodness he landed in Rutherford. And we've kept that vision alive. We're known for our Cabernet Sauvignons. We're known for our Rutherford Cabernet Sauvignons. And Jim Allen started making those in the historic over 120-year-old barn on the property. And we've expanded a little bit more to 3 now estate vineyard holdings, one of which is the wine we'll taste tonight.
Can't wait. I actually have a little bit tasted thus far, but more to come on that. Elizabeth, Conn Creek was also founded in the 70s, really the decade that was the great second golden age of the Napa Valley. And today it's owned by Saint Michel Wine Estates. Tell us the story.
Yeah, Conn Creek, as you said, was founded in the early 70s in 1973 by the Collins family. And at the time they had a property in St. Helena. And this winery, our location, was established in 1979. And, one of the significant contributions of our winery is that we focused on environmental part of the building, where the original founders put in cork and styrofoam for insulation at the time. But Conn Creek Winery focuses on AVA wines, Rutherford being one of them, and Anthology, our flagship wine, which is Rutherford based.
Yes, and whenever I think of Conn Creek, I always think of, in a sense, your sister, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars as well, which is also owned by Saint Michel Vintners. Okay, so the 2 of you, and I do want to say, I'm going to ask a question now, but I want to encourage all of our viewers to jump on the chat and leave your comments, ask some questions. Doesn't have to be a question, though. We love comments as well. So we want to see that chat start rolling. Before we telescope down and taste these wines, though, you know what I'm going to ask, which is, much has been written and hypothesized about what Andrei Chelychev, the great so-called father of California winemaking, and Andrei was perhaps one of the most influential, if not the most influential winemaker of the 20th century in California. He was the first to use the term Rutherford dust, and many people have tried to imagine what he meant by it. Did he mean a flavor? Did he mean a kind of cocoa-y texture? What do each of you think? Elizabeth, what do you think is meant by Rutherford dust?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Like, I think Rutherford, I think for those who've ever gone to the Rutherford Dust Society tasting, there is an underlying theme, I believe, in Rutherford wines. And I think for those of us that are familiar with the term Rutherford dust, it is a cocoa note, sweet tobacco note, and some dark bramble. I think is very classic Rutherford. And I think that for those of us who work in Rutherford and work with the wines in Rutherford, we find that to be a common theme amongst the wines. I mean, of course, we all put our own little spin on it, but I think that's the commonality that we have in Rutherford, unlike any other AVA.
Molly, jump in here. What do you think?
Well, it's so fun to talk about Andrei Chelychev. Andrei consulted at Sequoia Grove with my previous boss, Mike Trujillo. So I don't know if that gives me an edge to throw down with Elizabeth on what I think the definition is, because it's a little bit humorous that we don't exactly all agree, but I think we're talking about the same thing, but maybe the terms we don't use are exactly the same. So when I talk about it, I think that Rutherford dust is the combination, you have to have both, that's key, of black cherry and cocoa powder. Sometimes, depending on how the wine is made, it could be pencil lead and cocoa powder, but those two components together, to me, that's Rutherford dust.
Wow, very interesting. When I first came to Napa Valley, I drove up to BV, Beaulieu Vineyard, on that one day. It was probably 1978 or so. And there, it was during harvest. There was Andrei peering over a big vat of just brought in grapes. Andrei Chelychev, for anyone who has read a little bit about Napa Valley, may know that he was a very tiny man, 4'11", all 80 pounds of him. And he was smoking a Gauloise, a French cigarette. It was, there are many stories, classic Andrei Chelychev stories. But having listened to him and interviewed him many times as a young journalist, he always, he wasn't afraid to talk about like a dirt smell, a good, clean, dusty dirt smell. And so I'm just adding in, that's what I think he might have meant. But I like both of your definitions as well. All right, or thoughts as well on that. Let's taste some wines here. Molly, we want to start with your Sequoia Grove. Let me hold it up to the camera. There we go. Just want to, always a little hard to get the camera to focus there, but there it is. And let's taste that first. I'm going to ask you about its texture and about its flavor, because I have a bit of a theory about this wine, but you go, tell me.
So I spend so much time with these wines, and I think when you say dirt, I think we're so used to walking the vineyards and being in the vineyards. It's kind of, we smell it all day long, every day. So it's humorous to think, oh, it is dirt smell, but I agree with that as well. So I get, there's definitely a savory quality to this wine. I am very lucky. I've been working with this vineyard since Sequoia Grove took it over in 2010. And every year we have the black cherry, we have the cocoa powder, but there's this savory tension that's really intriguing. Maybe a little cassis character coming up. And as I swirl and as I smell it, there's like that fresh cherry that is so lovely. a little bit of a floral, like a floral earth. Can you say that? Has a definite beautiful lift to it.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about two words that you've just said. One is tension and the other is lift. Both of these terms, I think, are really so important, such great terms, but what do you mean by them? Because I don't think everybody uses those terms or knows what those mean.
Yeah, and here I want to turn around and ask the questions to you, but because I want to hear what Andre said about this, because what has been passed down to me from Mike Trujillo, from Andre Chalachev to me, is the greatest wines in the world are wines of balance. And one of those components is the acidity and the fruit in conjunction with the barrel and the alcohol. And all of that together as the greatest wines in the world. So, but acid is one of those components. And it shouldn't be covered up with oak, that beautiful fruit character. So I think the fresh fruit, and then as you take a sip, it's that acidity in the palate that makes you want to take another sip, that kind of refreshes your tongue, that I look for in wines and is really enjoyable.
Such a good way of explaining tension, the idea of a kind of magnetic field, if you will, of fruit and freshness from acidity pulling you and pulling and pushing against each other and giving the wine a sense of aliveness. Before we go to Elizabeth, I will tell you that this idea of freshness being important to Andre, I did ask him once about that, and he got this little glimmer in his eye, and he began to tell me that great wines, you could tell when a wine was great, in part from its aroma. And I said, well, what? He said, it has to have a fresh aroma. And I said, what is a fresh aroma, Andre? And he said, this was Andre Chalachev, I swear, not me. He said, it's the smell of a young woman's arm when she's a little sweaty and she has taken off her opera gloves, her long opera gloves. I thought, okay, only Andre Chalachev, right? He was born to Russian nobility, so he knew what, I guess, a young woman's arm smelled like underneath her leather opera gloves. So whether that's Rutherford dust or not, I don't know. Let's go to.
It sounds glamorous and enticing, very romantic. Sorry to interrupt.
We want to bring Elizabeth here in on the conversation. Let me hold up the concrete. Let's see if we can get there we go. You can see the concrete now. Elizabeth, talk to us about this wine.
So our Rutherford cab comes from 3 different vineyards here in Rutherford. One is which is our little tiny property here in front of the winery, which is only 2 acres, so it's our estate property. The other is a vineyard we've worked with since 2005 called Hojoni. And Hojoni is located at the very northern end of Rutherford on the eastern side. And also George's 3. There's also a little bit of George's 3, which is south of us. And I actually, Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's right next door to Tonella Vineyard. And so we have 3 different vineyards in here. And my descriptor for this is, I know Molly says lift. Sometimes I call fruit like a high tone fruit note. And I think for me in this one, it's a little high tone like blackberry jam, maybe a sweet fennel or sweet tobacco with black cherries and some cocoa powder. And the texture, I'm really big on texture with wines, is trying to find a good balance of barrels that bring out the texture without overwhelming the fruit and creates a longevity on the finish. And in this case, we did use 100% New French oak with the 3 different vineyards. But, I think it's a nice, soft, elegant Rutherford wine.
Thanks everybody who's jumping on the chat. Thanks Michael and Aga for your comments. Let's stay with that for a second, Elizabeth, because some of the very first tastings that I ever did of Rutherford wines, I thought, whoa, there's tannin, right? I mean, you can get some real power from Rutherford. And yet in both the Conn Creek as well as the Sequoia Grove, there is a kind of, the wines are not at all aggressive. You sense the tannin as structure, but you don't feel it as, I don't know, a nail file or something that would be really rough. So how do you get there, Elizabeth? How do you get to have structure in wine, but not feel tannin aggressively?
I think this in 2018, it had a lot to do with the vintage. We had a very cool vintage. So we didn't see a lot of maybe the heat that we saw in 2017. 2018 was cool throughout the summer and into the final season of harvest. So we got a lot of hang time. And I think it really gave a lot of opportunity for the seeds to slowly ripen. And I think also for tannins, at least for me, when we're dealing with tannins in the cellar, it's all about cap management. So what I mean by cap management is when we're doing pump overs, it's you're either increasing or slowing things down to extract more tannins. And as you get closer to the end of fermentation, it's more seed tannins. But I think because 2018 was such a cool year, like for us here at Conn Creek, we were able to go till dryness on the seeds without over extracting seed tannins. But I think the vintage overall really lended itself to a softer tannin style versus maybe like a vintage like this year where we had to be really careful.
Yeah. Molly, I want to get you in on this question too, because tannin is for any maker of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, Rutherford, or many of the mountain appellations as well, making a soft wine is not, I mean, it may help. Of course, a vintage does help, as Elizabeth is pointing out. But it's a pretty magical thing to be able to do with wines that, left to their own devices, may want to be much more tannic than these are.
Yeah, I'm going to be the first winemaker to say that I do not have all the answers when it comes to tannin. Wine is a complex thing with color and tannin and a lot going on. What I do and how I think about making wine, vintage to vintage, I'm really good at listening. So when I walk the vineyards and when I taste the fermenters, I'm listening to what the grapes are saying. I'm listening to what the wine wants to be. And it's giving me clues. Does it need more? Does it need less? Do I do this? Do I do that? And, sometimes the assistant winemaker gets annoyed because I like to taste by myself. Because if you taste with somebody else and they're talking, it's harder to listen. And to me, each vintage and each wine and each vineyard is revealed as you kind of get the feedback over the days, over the weeks, as it's progressing. That's all I can say about how I deal with the tannins.
It's such an interesting idea, though, because I was once told about a class. I didn't have the courage to do this myself as a wine teacher, but a class in Europe where everyone came in and the wines were in front of the students. And the teacher said, okay, I want you to taste wine number 1. We're not going to talk about it. I just want you to sit there and think about it for 45 minutes. And because people were like, wait a minute, I wrote my note. I want to talk. And she said, you really don't. You really ought to sit there with it for a while and just listen, to use your words. It could be true that none of us listen enough into wines. It's really a beautiful thought because they will express themselves, right? Yvonne is asking, why all new oak? And I think it's the Conn Creek that has all new oak. Elizabeth, want to jump back in on that?
Sure. I think with some of the really tremendous vineyards that we get, I think tannin plays into it, but I think when I'm choosing the oak, if I think the tannins, if I think the wine can handle it, I will go ahead and shoot for 100%. I think the majority of our AVA series, I do shoot for new barrels because I think the wines can handle the tannins. I do a lot of whole berry barrel ferment as well. So with our mountain vineyards in particular, big tannin wines can handle a big tannin barrel with that like a medium plus structure, and it balances. And what I find is when you pair the two, it really elevates the fruit and integrates the texture of the wine. But I also do a blend of the different barrels. So when I say 100% new French oak, it's not always all power barrels. There's some medium styled barrels to kind of balance and focus more elevation on the fruit. So it's kind of a mix of barrels, but they are 100%. And I think with the vineyards that we get, they do lend themselves to being able to handle that much of it.
It's striking me. It has struck me listening to you as you said, if I think then X is happening, I'm going to do Y. It takes so much confidence to be a winemaker, right? Do you ever lay awake at night thinking, oh my God, I get one chance here, one chance a year. And what if I call it wrong? Or no, you're just like, you know what? I'm trained. I know what I'm doing. I don't question myself.
No, I would say after I finished the 2018 vintage, I was like, gosh, what just happened? I mean, I think because it was a huge vintage for us. I don't know about Molly, but we came in 30% heavier on everything. And there are times, no, of course I question it, but I think if it's easier for people to think about it, it's a lot like cooking. Like I very much describe winemaking like cooking. And like when you make that pasta sauce, as you taste it over and over again, what elements you think you need. And for me, it's the same with wines. Is you get the wine, you're fermenting it in tank, and then you kind of get an idea. And I think it's just over time, you build that confidence that you think, okay, well, it needs a little bit of this or it needs a little bit of that. I mean, I'm not always confident, I can tell you that. There are times where, well, like I said, at the 2018 vintage, I was like, God, what just happened? There are vintages like this year where I'm like, God, this vintage is killer. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, if one wasn't occasionally worried, they wouldn't be paying attention, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I want to hear each of you comment on each other's wines. So let's on this Conn Creek, Molly, your thoughts, because they're very different in their specific styles, although there is a thread that unites them as both Rutherford Cabernets. But Molly, your thoughts on the Conn Creek. It's always fun to ask winemakers their thoughts on somebody else's wine.
Yeah, I really love this wine. I never would have guessed that it's 100% new oak. I think the oak is really integrated. And I think one of the things that I would say about oak, not to diverge, but that oak is not, and I think you've done a really beautiful job here, that oak is not a flavoring, it's a vehicle to evolve the wine. And I get maybe, like you said, a lusciousness and a lift and a longevity on the palate. Maybe that's where that very well selected oak is coming in to give it kind of a thickness and a voluptuousness, a lusciousness that's really lovely. And then there's a dark brooding character on the nose that really invites you in and you want to get to know it a little bit more. I think it's a really beautiful wine, and it's fun that it's a blend because you can maybe, if you knew the vineyards better, you could pick out like, oh, that's that character from that vineyard and that's that character from that vineyard. Because I get a little, different notes where it might be a riper vineyard and then there might be a vineyard that's a little bit cooler coming up. So it's beautiful.
I like the dark brooding idea. I mean, English majors, this is our world, Heathcliff, right? It's such a good idea. And this idea, Molly, of oak not being meant ever to be a flavoring in and of itself, but to be a sort of invisible stuffing underneath the wine to help it express itself is really beautifully said. We sometimes forget that. But who goes to all the trouble of growing expensive, great grapes and then wants to cover them up, right? That makes no sense. So, Elizabeth, let's get you in on the Sequoia Grove.
Yeah, I opened this a little bit earlier, and I keep going back to it because it does evolve with a little more air. And I don't know if Molly uses this word. I find it very intriguing. I get a lot of that cedar. I do definitely get black cherry and tobacco. And there is, as you mentioned earlier, because they were in my notes, there's an earthiness, like almost like a forest floor type note to it. Very beautifully perfumed and great mid-palate texture and soft, elegant finish that I get on it. I think it just keeps evolving as I've been tasting it over the last hour or so.
Yeah. Can wine be powerful and elegant at the same time?
I absolutely think so. I think there are many wines that are great examples of that.
How would you tell when you had a wine? Like what are the two things that you say to yourself, this is powerful, but this is elegant at the same time? Like what exactly are you tasting that lets you know that?
For me, I'm looking for the whole package. I'm looking for, I love the classic Napa Cabernet, the big, beautiful, dark bouquet and the big texture in the mid palate. My biggest thing it's like what I'm always looking for in wines is I love silkiness of tannins. Like I'm such a huge fan of that. Again, texture is such a big thing for me when it comes to wines. And I think that like big wines have that silky tannins that make you want to keep coming back for more. And then I think the longevity in wines is such a great example of great winemaking and the fruit that's there.
I love nuance. I mean, I think you have to have those. I get like a dusty tannin, I think, in the Rutherford wines. And so you have to have that larger, bigger, evolved tannins. But then the reason I got into winemaking was I love flavor. And I got into winemaking before I could legally drink. So I discovered wine through
You
cooking.
mean there was someone else besides Elizabeth and me who did that?
I mean, maybe that's how everybody gets into wine, but when you're not drinking, you're awoken to, fresh basil for the first time. And to me, that's what the elegance is that layers of flavor that I look for in wines that give, oh, it's changing. What is this now? Oh, I'm getting this. And then when you have those fine grained, beautiful cocoa powder tannins, that's where you get the power coming in. So those two together, I think, is what Rutherford does so beautifully.
That was beautifully said as well. I wonder if for each of you, if a wine can be ever too soft. Is that a possibility?
Yes.
Yeah. And what would that tell you, Molly?
I think that's where the acidity and the liveliness and the freshness comes in. Not to get into the nitty gritty of pH, and it all has to do with balance. So there's no hard fact that pH means, the wine is, not right. But I think we've all tasted them, and then, you maybe have to do your winemaking magic to adjust the balance of those wines.
I would say for me, I don't know, is your question Karen as a final like wine as it being too soft, because I'm like, I mean, I think it depends. Like if you're eating it with your food and you have something that's higher in acidity and it balances out, I mean, is there anything wrong with the wine being on the softer end? I think it's all depending on what your expectations are. You know, I mean, I think personally, there's like a wine for everybody. And I just think it depends on what you're eating or what your expectation of it is. You know, I don't
I
know.
guess, I guess the question comes from Elizabeth that, you know, as Americans, we think of softness and richness and concentration and saturation as kind of inherently good things. But I'll never forget tasting with the late Stephen Spurrier once, and we were tasting a whole bunch of wines, like way too many wines. And we, you know, came upon this Bordeaux, and he said, "Thank God, tannin." And this wine was really scratchy and almost impossible to drink, I thought. And he said, "No, you know, soft wines can be kind of juvenile," I think is the word he used. And I thought, wow, no, you're kidding. I mean, that's a very strong statement. So and of course you would never get that in Rutherford, I don't think, because Rutherford is known for really having structured wine. And then inside that structure is a kind of soft, juicy, velvety richness. You know, it was just an interesting comment to me, and I'd never heard anyone not think softness was perfectly great all of the time.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like, I think your palate also evolves as you age and as your taste buds maybe change. So bitterness to me is something that like radicchio or bitter beers or something that in youth may be very off-putting, but is more, wakes you up a little bit more. And it's something, oh, I get, you know, I like that. So maybe it's something more along that line. You can appreciate it more as you get older.
Well, there is certainly noble bitterness, as you're pointing out, that is really a fascinating and fabulous character in wine. And when we were tasting both of these wines earlier here in my office, we thought that the dark chocolatey-ness of the wines, the dark cocoa-ness of the wines is kind of infused a bit with sea salt a little bit. Of course, there's no actual salt in wine, but we've all bitten into a candy bar that is dark chocolate and sea salt. That is such a killer combination. And both of these wines, to me, have a bit of, I guess you could call it minerality or something that's pulling it in a salty as well as a bitter direction.
I want a chocolate bar to go with these wines.
I know, getting hungry.
Woodhouse
sweet.
chocolates. Right? We all need that. Yeah. Well, thank you both, Molly and Elizabeth. These wines are so beautiful and so delicious. And lots of people jumping on the chat have also commented on other vintages. Eric is saying the 1974. Oh my God. Lucky you to have the 1974, any 1974 Rutherford wine, Eric. I'm sure you are really enjoying it. But I want to thank both of you for coming on tonight and being the first in our 4-part Rutherford series, exploring the great wines of this appellation. It's been so much fun to talk with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Great wines, Molly.
Back at you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for the time, Karen.
Great
Thank
wines,
you very
both of
much.
you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Karen MacNeil.
Thank you.